Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Julia Conzon. I'm a Master of Science student at Carleton University, Department of Geography and Environmental Studies. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm standing on unceded Algonquin territory. For those who don't know, it's Ottawa. My supervisors with me today, Dr. Peter Pulsifer, as well as a project team member, Dr. Sherry Fox, so they'll jump in at the end for the discussion. Today, I'm going to be presenting my proposal for my master thesis. I'm only into my first year, so I haven't really started the actual research itself. It's mainly at a proposal phase. Hopefully in a year, I can actually present some results. In terms of the research partners, aside from the Geographic Environmental Studies Department, the Geomatics and Cartographic Research Center, or the GCRC, is affiliated, as well as the Ittaq Civic Society and Ittaq Heritage and Research Center based in Clyde River. Today, I'll just present on my research background, the methods proposed, and some reflections and limitations, particularly in the state of COVID-19. So my research really came to be about through the democratization of cartography. We've seen so far in this session how there's maps now for fantasy or for video game development, and they're growing in terms of complexity. We have sessions in the coming days on urban wayfinding and mapping the pandemic, and we see it in art forms as well. And what I'm particularly interested in is the intersection of that as well as in participatory mapping and with human-computer interactions in web development and mapping. This is a growing interest, particularly for Indigenous and Inuit communities who are seeking self-determination and efforts towards reconciliation. And through this, we have to have considerations of data sovereignty, which was just discussed, and this is becoming ever more so prevalent in movements like what United Nations has for the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP. There's also the Global Indigenous Data Alliance CARE principles, which you can see in the top right-hand corner. And in the context of my research, there's also the National Inuit Strategy on Research, and all these lay out information on data storage, collection, management, processing, and the reflections on how this information should be controlled and owned by the Indigenous communities that are involved in such collaborations. So what I'm really interested in is in this intersection, and so what I'll be developing for my research is a web maps and more very closely with the Clyde River community, particularly the Ittaq Research Center. So Clyde River is a hamlet that's based in Bampin Island in Nunavut. It has a population of just over 1,000 people according to the 2016 census. And the Ittaq Civic Society was founded in 1997. It is a wellness center that organizes various different community initiatives like a library, a school breakfast program. They also have Ittaq language counseling and training. Aside from just these efforts, they've also established in 2005 the Ittaq Heritage and Research Center. And the Ittaq Research Center offers land-based programming in which we have participants from elders to youth who are working on hunting programming. Every year they do a program, and they do it throughout the year as well. They've also established in collaboration with researchers and with industry weather stations. I think there's about 5 now, at least, if not at least 4, and they're across the region, and they're collecting wind direction, wind speed, wind pressure, air pressure as well. And aside from just that, they also are implementing in collaboration with the GCRC Garmin InReach devices for collecting wildlife observations as well. So when they're out in the fields doing their programs, they also can collect information that they can use for local decision making, such as travel planning, or to maintain their subsistence ways of living. So where GCRC also falls in is that we have been partnered up with Ittaq to develop the Clyde River Knowledge Atlas. This started in 2015 prior to my research being involved, but in it there are various different multimedia modules or atlases, as most of you will be familiar with. And these multimedia modules basically take the data from the weather station as well as all the data that's collected through the various different community-based initiatives to basically present that information for public to use, but they also have internal private tools as well that they use for internal purposes that cannot be seen by the public. Furthermore, this atlas is developed with GCRC's Nunavut Atlas framework. It's an open source repository code on a framework that supports multimedia visualization. So it uses open source libraries like OpenLayers for the cartographic representations, but they also use other types of visualizations like D3. So here's just a little example of one of the modules within the Atlas. This is place names. As mentioned, multimedia includes things like points, lines, and polygons, or geographic representations, but it also has audio recordings, there's images, I think there's some videos embedded as well. As you hover over these points, you'll have the place name presented to you in Ittaq and syllabic as well. And if you go to the right, there is also just additional attribute information. And importantly, you can see in the top right-hand corner, there's a login system. And if you're a community member, you can log in and have access to additional other atlases as well. This is a visualization of the Nunavut Coastal Resource Inventory, which started in 2007 by the Nunavut government. In 2014, they started a chapter in Clyde River in which community participants collected or worked with the government to basically draw out static paper maps, their observations of wildlife, hunting camps, as well as their hunting routes. It was then digitized and now has been presented on Atlas as well. Yes, it looks a little overwhelming, but of course you can filter down the information. So in this case, it shows the camps and the travel routes as well. There's been some community feedback that the interface is not necessarily entirely intuitive. So there's some considerations on how we can make this more user-friendly for the community. Aside from just geographic representations, there's also the use of D3 for other types of visualizations, and this just shows historical weather patterns from the weather stations between 2016 and 2018. So aside from just existing data within the Clyde River Knowledge Atlas, which hosts the data in a CouchDB NoSQL database to avoid complex relationships that might be difficult to adapt as we scale, there's also discussions on how we can develop new modules as well, and this is kind of where my research really kicks off. From Colorado State University, Glenn Liston has been working closely with Clyde River for, I would say, about at least 20 years. Sherry might correct me later on. Glenn has developed a lot of different environmental models in close relationship with Clyde River, and particularly Ittaq researchers and staff members. And in this case, this is a model that predicts ocean wave heights. And you can see in the visualization, given different wind direction, the wave heights predictions are different. And what's particularly interesting in the case of his research is that he considers the fjords, and that's a huge influence to them in terms of not only the wind, but also thus the wave heights as well. And so this offers a more unique lens because it's localized and contextualized for the community for travel planning purposes. There has, however, been feedback that some of the visualizations might not necessarily meet optimal or operational use for travel planning. So where my research will come in is essentially taking the existing Nunavut framework as well as other open source code, repurpose it, refactor it, and then develop a prototype or a minimal viable product to eventually serve on the Atlas through the model outputs. And this will be carried out through a co-production model or approach. So just a little example of this is repurposing open source code from Earth. It's a GitHub repository by Cameron Beccario. In this case, it shows the classic flow visualizations of ocean currents, but you can see it also for wind as well. Another notable thing here is that there are gaps in the actual data, particularly in the hamlet inlets as was presented in the Glenn's previous model visualization. So the idea is, okay, how can we repurpose some of this code, but of course refine it closely with Ittaq staff members and maybe more broadly with other community members to make sure that the tool meets practicalities, realities, and goals that they want to really use it for travel planning and other purposes that they claim they want it for, or they state that they want it for. So to accomplish this, as mentioned, it will be developing a prototype, and that will be done through close collaboration with Ittaq staff members. And then further, we'll evaluate its usability and utility to assure that the prototype meets their requirements and needs. So to accomplish this, it'll be a very collaborative and iterative process. And for software developers, that's an Agile Environment. And this will be carried out through unstructured gatherings and workshops. Gatherings will, as I'll be based in Ottawa because of the state of COVID. Currently, for example, Nunavut was in lockdown. I think it's just opening up more now. Iqaluit's still locked down. We'll have to have all the gatherings virtually, at least for myself, and then community members might gather at Ittaq Research Center. Otherwise, we'll have to be nimble and try to adapt where we can. The gatherings with Ittaq staff will be about 3, and more broadly from the fall into possibly the winter, we'll have some workshops with broader community members to seek feedback as well. Through this process, we'll essentially, compile the existing data from the database, look at maybe the weather station data, work closely with Glenn on the model side. We'll start designing and brainstorming some kind of prototype visuals, and then we'll start actually programming it, or probably I'll be mostly programming it, but sharing my code, and then we'll start testing it out and evaluating to assure that the requirements that were initially specified are then met for the final kind of minimal viable product that would eventually be hosted on the Atlas. So to evaluate such plans, of course, there'll be a kind of a comparative discourse analysis based off of transcriptions and discussions. We hope to have a live translator present, so of course the participants can speak in their preferred language of Ittaq. Furthermore, if we have the time and permitted by the community, we might consider things like A/B testing, seen in human-computer interactions, for more of a quantitative analysis. So just a brief little visual of the workflow. The first step, of course, is always listening and learning. I'm not going there with the prescribed plan. I have some ideas to generate some conversations if we feel like it's necessary, but I'm there to listen and learn. It's an opportunity for Ittaq to share their knowledge with me, and I can prepare some ideas and we can share together. We'll start wireframing ideas, going pen, paper, sketching out ideas, having to share it on our screens. And if not, hopefully we can maybe use some online platforms like Figma, if permitted by the community, to host some information or data or ideas on a third-party server. But the idea is really formalizing those conceptions into something a bit more concrete that can then go from a low-fidelity prototype to more of a high-fidelity prototype with actual functionalities developed in open-source JavaScript libraries. Then from there, we'll do some demoing, of course, presentations to show where the this formalization is coming. Might go back to some wireframing depending on feedback, and eventually get more into the actual testing once major bugs are resolved and it's more functional for use. And of course, in terms of usability, that is ease of use. So making sure, all the functionalities that were requested are easy to access, easy to navigate to, and utility in terms of, usefulness. Does it meet the required functions and needs that have been expressed initially? So to end off, thinking about the reflections and limitations, a huge one, of course, is COVID-19. This was kind of mentioned in the previous session. There's going to be a risk of community disengagement. This is just kind of inevitable. It just depends on how things go. For example, I have to have all my work documented, all my the letter of intent translated in Ittaq, but unfortunately the translation services in Iqaluit have been closed because of the lockdown, so things like this just get delayed, but that's the nature of it. Also, of course, there's also the possibility of knowledge transfer being lost. We'll be communicating orally as well as, through, text communications and drawing, but there's inevitably embodied knowledge that gets lost. It'll be difficult, particularly to express through a screen because I'll be based in Ottawa, as mentioned. And furthermore, what gets exacerbated is, the risk of internet connectivity issues. Ittaq has internet access. Some members or participants might not at their household, so they might have to come to the center. So we'll have to think about that kind of stuff as well as we go through with the research. So with that, I'll end there. Thank you very much for your time. I've been enjoying all the sessions thus far, and we'll open it up for questions. Thank you.